name is Nolan Flynn, and I'm currently located in Salt Lake City, Utah. I'm a visual artist who primarily uses mixed media. Um, I've been painting pretty much all my life. Um, the media in particular that I use is pretty much anything under the sun on stretched canvas, primarily. Anything from crayons, charcoal, airbrush, oil paint, acrylic paint, gesso, anything that I can get my hands on quick is kind of the presence in my paintings. Currently, the show at Kellis Contemporary Logical Elasticity is my newest work and current body of work that kind of encompasses my emotional kind of quest and the edits and the narrative that unfolds on the page or on the surface of the paintings. Initially from my point of conception or point of entrance into the studio or in front of that particular piece, the thoughts and ideas in my mind or emotions or stressors, I initially start and place on the canvas and kind of like a brief kind of literal notes or even some sketches. They then evolve in kind of a really quick, brief, urgent edit into something much greater. Similar to like Jean Cousteau's work, you know, the idea and the importance of the idea is somewhat greater than the actual end piece. So what I like to do is I just evolve naturally basing on weight. You know, how much is something important? If it's like a world event, if it's something that's personal, if it's something that's greater in stress, then obviously it takes more weight. So then it moves on and some like minor things get edited out. So then notes then become sketches and sketches become edits. And, you know, the ideas and emotions and stressors of greater importance or weight get more color, get more visual kind of importance in a hierarchical scale. And so then the pieces evolve even further. And so they become kind of this narrative about the entire piece and the thought process behind the painting. And the idea of, you know, that urgent, quick edit and the ideas behind what goes into a painting and asking us, you know, what we even consider a finished painting, or if the idea is that much more urgent and real rather than something that's more polished and maybe doesn't have that kind of interconnectivity or axis. That's actually a really great question. In many cases, everyone would ask, well, these don't even look done. And that's the point. You know, with new information, new experiences brings new ideas and change. I could walk in the painting behind me and just go ahead and change it right now because of everything I've learned and I've surpassed from when that painting was originally conceived, or at least placed on hold. So the paintings like Marcel Duchamp live in this kind of infralim, this zone that's not necessarily considered complete, but it's hard to describe because they're always changing and evolving. And that's what's so interesting because they look very much unfinished. You know, it's how do we consider, many people don't consider a sketch, you know, that important. But if you think about sketch in like a visual language, like many people do, you know, it transcends language. You know, you can make a sketch that's easily accessible. It looks very childish to some degree because everyone, like language, has the ability to do so. And so just kind of getting after it and kind of changing and adjusting continually and just rotating pieces, you know, they're all pretty much in the works. Actually, it was formerly trained in portraiture. So, you know, structural facades, planes, you know, gradients, glazes. And it got very less challenging and boring. And you know, if it's not challenging and doesn't like lure you in, and there's not that excitement and that kind of roller coaster ride where you're continually painting in the moment, it kind of lost that drive. That's what's really interesting about my current pieces and my current body of work there at the Catalyst Contemporary is a lot of the work, it's not, I have no idea what they look like when I start, and I have no idea what they look like when they get set aside. And a lot of that's actively painting and making decisions in the moment in kind of this like pseudo meta critique in the act of painting. And it's very difficult because you're moving so fast, you're moving your hands and you're trying to get as many ideas down and then edit and critique yourself while you're kind of clawing at the walls and shooting up. And so that to me is like, I guess thus far is the epitome of challenge. Is like you're trying to encompass everything that you want to say and want to learn from, and whether it's world issues, whether it's personal struggles, and you're trying to kind of both visually and linguistically kind of grapple that. And that to me is more challenging than painting something in a representational or formal way. Not that it's bad, but it's just not my cup of tea. I'd like to start completely fresh each time, unless there's like a kind of like a narrative that's been like happening through multiple paintings. If something in my life is happening, or there's an issue, a larger issue, like a world issue, that's continually evolving, like an open door, we get new information, we're told this, I internalize this. Unless it's changing and still concurrently happening, then yeah, there'll be a through line. Absolutely. Especially if it's very influential, and so that, along with my own kind of response, whether it's visual or literal, is something that is entirely important and a really good question. Almost all the time. I think art, at least for myself, is very much emotional. It's emotionally driven. It's emotionally questioned. Whether it's from the heart, from the mind, from the body, it's always a challenge. We're always trying to readdress. Look at ourselves on the outside, question what we don't understand, and I think I'm always trying to grasp that. How can I emulsify this? How can I get to this? And so moving through that, it's very much therapeutic as it is a way to digest what's happening in the world. That's a great question. Every time I see a painting or walk by it in passing, I'm like, oh man, I need to change that now, or this needs to be adjusted. And that's why I think it's nice, in many cases we put these like precious items on the wall and like there they are, but all these big paintings, I live with them. They become almost these people that move around in the house. I'm constantly moving them around the studio, putting them somewhere else. And so I see them in different lights. I see them in different areas. And I'm obviously under different circumstances every particular place. So my response to them is so much different. They're not as much a precious item as they are almost like a catalog or like a narrative of ever unfolding information and input. Whether it's by my own hand or, what I hear or some other type of point of reference. So they're always in flux. So in a similar kind of vein as my process, there's a lot of urgency. I'm not like seeking certain colors. It's what's available, what's urgent, because, what I have in my mind is, ever flowing. And so keeping up with pace is whatever's urgent. And obviously, you can see certain urgency in like quick wet gesso edits or even just really brief marks. It's not like curated per se. And at the time when I was sewing canvas together, I was running out of materials and I needed materials as soon as I could. So I just ripped apart old canvases and threw them through my sewing machine and sewed them up because I had to keep moving. I was in the zone. I had so much to say and so much to kind of question. I couldn't not sit around and be like, well, we'll just hop on the computer and order some canvas. It's like, no, this is going to have to happen now. Because, when we lose that kind of, I guess, that energy and that focus, it's that focus that I think you can get to the next level as long as you let that run. Because who knows when you'll be the same in that same mindset. Well, that's the most interesting thing is there's no particular point in which I want them to see something. I think it's weighted to say, you need to see this or take this. I guess like there's a lot of energy in my pieces and there's a lot of like hidden meaning, I think you could say. And to say, well, it's up to the viewer to do anything, that's fine. But I think ultimately, art is about accessibility. If I wanted to create this beautiful painting with 27 layers of cheek facade, that's great, but no one's going to know how to do that. So it's going to be very unapproachable. I want my paintings to be energetic, kind of give them the idea it's okay to make strange, funny marks and use whatever you have, crayons. You should get motivated to be creative, but at the same time, understand like maybe it's time to question what we perceive as art. Is there a way that we can kind of say, hey, look at this lovely little sketch that Johnny or Sarah did. Let's put it on the fridge. Like, this is beautiful. It's like that certain sincerity of line and just urgency is something it's hard to capture, and that's why I don't like to imagine what my pieces could be or plan my pieces out, because it loses that certain urgency. And that's why I think I'd like people to understand is like, it's out there. You just have to do it. Photography doesn't, I guess, in a normal mindset, influence my work at all. I'd like to think that I have, when I imagine things or when I have dreams or when I think of like ideas to input or place on the canvas, depending on the weight of the seriousness and the idea and the importance, a lot of times I think of in almost like in a photographic mindset. So I can think of a scene or think of a place, and then I'll, sketch it out real quick. And so not in like a general sense. I'm not like slapping it on or like projecting images. It's all very much, it's like an insular memory that I then just kind of regurgitate or use my body as a medium, we'll say, to reproduce the imagery that I see in my mind. But absolutely, I think photography is wonderful in many sense, because it's something that we can't just achieve naturally. I've explored the ideas of resin and what that could mean, and the implications between like the physical elements, the layering elements. Because of the paintings that I have, like at Catalyst, they're very much urgent. There's no need to stretch a canvas and gesso the whole entire thing. Why can't it just be gessoed portions if you need to? There's a certain kind of skin-like nature to the raw canvas. But the strange thing about the epoxy is how inaccessible it does make the paintings. And however inaccessible, it does create this other dimension to the paintings, because you have physical evidence of layers of paint and almost like a topographical map. And so I'm kind of exploring the ideas of how, like in paintings, instead of ideas just overlapping on a two-dimensional plane, how they could potentially overlap on a three-dimensional plane. If you could expand on that, it would essentially become more sculptural. Super toxic and hella heavy, but it incites different questions. And I'm just trying to kind of explore that idea, and maybe there's a better solution for that. But I'm always trying to challenge, I guess, my voice through different materials, because I'm sure there's always a better way to do it. Oh, that's a fabulous question. A lot of times, for people who don't know, there's actually dates and times embedded into the paintings. When I think of something, or when something happens, like a monumental moment or a point of inclusion, I'll document it in the act, similar to like a journal, or to give it some more validity. Because like everything, time is fleeting, our ideas are fleeting, my memory is fleeting, I can tell you that. But they do, in a way, kind of almost like slow down time. That was really interesting when you said like freeze time, because a camera captures an image, and it does essentially freeze a moment in time. Everything's slow motion. But without, I guess in my paintings, when you don't give all the visual information, what's left is the viewer or audience. There's a greater chance they'll be able to fill in whatever information seems to be devoid. And when you have that devoid bit, or the allowance for exploration or imagination and creativity from the viewer, then everything becomes personal, right? You have the ability to connect to people without giving them all the information, saying, hey, this is what you need to see, this is why you need to see it, without getting into conceptual thinking. Just in a purely kind of a visceral response, there's enough information for people to understand certain like basic elements, but also allow enough like room to breathe to kind of input their own like experiential kind of information and conditioning into that. I like to paint large, and it's not just because it's fun. It's because they're life size, and in many cases, the ideas that I have are larger than my body. They're larger than anything that I can encompass. Because of that, I believe that it's important to, use your whole entire body, because your body is a very good conductor for emotion. You can express with your body in a large brushstroke or a line so much more visually through like, post-verbal communication than you can in like a tiny, minute mark. And so for me, that kind of humanistic emotion through stroke, through like post-verbal communication, when we think of line and, brushstrokes transcending language, actual tangible language, that to me is really important. And especially when you have these large scale paintings, they hierarchically show size and shows importance. And I think that's what ultimately makes me drawn to that size. Because if it's any smaller, it's much more difficult to paint and not as successful. Yeah, I mean, I'm on the side trying to work on ways to maybe emulsify it into something even less, because in itself, the stretcher and the canvas is something that's you have to prepare for and you have to stretch for, and that in itself is it's still a hang up that I'm working through. Reason being is if your thoughts are so urgent, then it shouldn't matter what you're painting on, right? Or even marking on for that matter. And I totally agree with that. And so they're obviously, like everything, they're in evolution. But in terms of a performative aspect, when I'm painting, I'm kind of allowing myself the accordance to do whatever I want and to make the strokes I want, to move my body the way I want. But the lack of gesso and the raw canvas, there was never a need for it to be anything like pristine. And to spend all this time and money, gessoing, making the gesso, sanding it, it didn't feel right, because then it seemed like I was preparing for something that wasn't as, I guess it was more precious than maybe I thought. And so then it became already like laden with this precious object, when in my mind it was something that was more visceral and immediate and raw, and it didn't need to be like conveyed on this like beautiful golden belt to the viewer. It was like, listen, here's the deal. I only needed to do what I needed to do to make it through what I had to say in this particular setting, that threshold of time. And I think it's important moving forward for me to kind of focus on that, because we need to question like our parameters, right? And how we contain ourselves or ideas, because the containers themselves obviously help inform of what we have to say inherently. Let's just say we'll call it the packaging. I've started to experiment on just found objects. I've started to experiment on just in canvas and just have them unstretched. Why go through the labor of building this huge object, just to paint on, when I'm already thinking about things and there's so many things that are influencing my life. Like, why can't I just roll it on? And so I'm working with that right now. And I think the results are already speaking for themselves. If you can like pull away all the weight, pull away all the variables, pull away all the, I guess the confluences like color, you're going to get something that's a lot more visceral and immediate and urgent than saying even having color laying around. So in terms of my stretcher bars or my containers, if I can contain time, if I can contain, the structure in which it's built and the material in which it's on the surface, I think that's the next thing, we want to make sure that I think in any practice, whatever the practice is done in, whatever materiality, I think it has to be influenced by the concept or the thought behind the work. Obviously you don't want to make paintings with cottage cheese, because what's that going to say? That's a totally different area. But as long as the work and the materials help kind of convey the idea behind the work, I think that's important. I've thought about that. I've also thought about, because arguably my handwriting's not the best, but just like anything, a mark an emotion, and the way that you write, it can convey an emotion behind the text. Now, there's a certain ambiguity associated with that, both in the sketch portion and as well as the written portion. And I like that kind of ambiguity. However, I have thought about making it less ambiguous because it will inherently be a lot easier to kind of key in. But that being said, though, there are also a lot of cons with that. Am I starting to hand everything over on a platter? Does it lose that kind of the accessibility and maybe conditional experiential treatment that the pieces would have? There's a lot of, I guess they're democratic in the sense, the color choice, the mark choice, but also in many cases people may see them as maybe PG, but there's a lot of like really quite visceral kind of intense moments, that are arguably rated, more than R. So I've kind of thought of the idea as if the language exists that's clear, if the sketches are clear, what would that do? Would it change how people access the work? How people plug the key in to open the door? Would it then change the audience range and make it only accessible to the few that understand, or would it sway the other way? And so I haven't quite figured that out, because in many cases I do wish them to be more understood, but at the same time, if you can play within kind of that realm of like transcending language, I think that's kind of ultimately the goal, because then you'll reach a greater audience. I'm not saying I have to reach the greatest audience in the world, but if you give away too many answers, then the work doesn't slow someone's, perception down, and I think that's really a great thing that my pieces do, is you can't just look at it and be like, bang, okay, see ya, all right, moving on. You kind of have to sit down and like read the work. You have to understand the brushstrokes. You have to look at the language that is obviously works and correlates well with the sketches in many cases, if it's the edits or if it's the actual tangible sketches. And I'm still kind of playing around with some ideas, but for right now, I'm happy with the work and where it's at and how, all the systems work together in kind of an unplanned but approachable and identifiable way. I mean, truthfully, anytime I get to be in the studios, I'm satisfied. But there's also a lot of anguish too. I feel like I'm constantly fighting an uphill battle when I paint, because I constantly feel like I'm ruining it. And I'll make small little kind of like, I'll champion some ideas and then I'll ruin it as well. I feel the best when I can put down something that's like very influential or very monumental, that's either happened to myself, happened to the world, or I've responded to something in such a way. And somehow it ends up like tying together really well with some of the visual sketches, because a lot of like I've said, it's like there's no planning, so it's kind of just like this chaotic mess that you're running through a forest with your eyes closed, and you're running into stuff and you're trying to take care of it right then, like a fire alarm, because the flow is continuing happening. The fire is still burning, so you have to keep running. But yeah, favorite part is just feeling the different types of materials and the certain urgencies, and identifying, right away, like you're zipping through wet gesso with, your vine charcoal, because you have that idea that's just burning your hand and you're pushing it through, and just the smell and the sensation. It's an experience, cognitively and physically. Ooh, broad question. I guess it depends on your objective. I guess in many cases, someone would consider selling paintings as being successful or being happy as being successful. And I can tell you this, I feel fairly optimistic. I don't sell many paintings. I'm being honest, but I think that's because I kind of embrace this almost ugly aesthetic. But I'm trying to. I guess success to me is pushing this idea of like post-verbal communication and kind of bring it in. Obviously, it's not a new idea, but reteach it and bring up this idea of different brush strokes, different lines, how some are weighted, how some are not weighted, how we can use those to convey full paragraphs, full books, full narratives, without even the aid of any type of like literary elements. And so success for me is continuing to do what I'm doing and reaching a larger audience and potentially even, rubbing some shoulders and brushing off some new ideas, and just getting people excited about making art. I don't care what type it is, but if you just want to look at something and just be energized and just be like so stoked, like screw it, let's go paint, or like let's go use whatever we have laying around the garage. That to me is successful. If I can reach a couple people that want to go home and just get jazzed up about being creative, then at the end of the day, that makes me so happy.